In the early 1920s, Portugal was a fragile republic, struggling under political chaos, financial instability, and a money that the public treated with growing suspicion. The Banco de Portugal, the country's central bank, had the power to issue banknotes and was responsible for keeping the national currency from collapsing. The escudo, Portugal's currency, was already under pressure from inflation and weak government finances, but few people imagined that one man with a forged document and a lot of nerve could nearly bring the entire system down. At the center of the story was a young, ambitious man named Artur Virgílio Alves dos Reis, often shortened to Alves Reis. He was born in 1896 in Lisbon into a working-class family and later trained as a railway engineer. But his real talent lay in forgery and persuasion. By the time he was in his late 20s, he had already been involved in several smaller financial cons and had spent time in prison, where he began to hatch a plan that would be far bigger than anything he had tried before. The goal was not to counterfeit money in the traditional sense, but to trick the system into printing perfectly legitimate banknotes that he did not have the right to print. Alves Reis knew that the Banco de Portugal did not print its own currency. Instead, it contracted the work out to a respected British firm, Waterlow Sons, which specialized in secure banknote printing. The Portuguese bank had sent Waterlow the official printing plates years earlier, along with strict instructions about who could order new notes and how many could be produced. Reis also knew that the bank's paperwork and signatures followed a familiar pattern, so he decided to forge a contract that looked as if it came straight from the central bank's boardroom, complete with forged signatures, seals, and official wording. In 1925, he traveled to London with his fake contract in hand, presenting himself as a high-level bank official with a special authorization to print new 500 escudo notes for the colony of Angola. The contract claimed that the Banco de Portugal wanted to finance development projects in Angola and needed a fresh batch of high-denomination banknotes to circulate in the colony. To the executives at Waterlow Sons, the document looked entirely legitimate. It matched previous agreements, bore what appeared to be the correct signatures, and carried the right official language and letterhead. Trusting what they believed was a legitimate order, the company began printing hundreds of thousands of 500 escudo notes using the same plates and paper it had always used for the Banco de Portugal. The printed notes were not counterfeit in the usual sense. They were physically identical to the official banknotes already in circulation. The only difference was that the Banco de Portugal had not authorized this particular run, and the central bank's own records were not updated to include the new serial numbers. Over the course of 1925, Waterlow shipped crates of these notes to Reis's addresses, first through intermediaries in London, and then onward to Portugal and beyond. In total, the unauthorized print run eventually amounted to about 100 million escudos, roughly 16.5% of all banknotes circulating in Portugal at the time. Reis now had the hardest part of the plan ahead of him, turning those perfectly printed notes into real money without triggering alarms. He created a fictional scenario around a new colonial bank called the Banco de Angola e Metrópole, which he claimed was being launched to finance infrastructure and trade between Angola and the mainland. Money from the printing operation was funneled into this bank, which appeared on paper to be a legitimate financial institution backed by a consortium of foreign investors. Reis opened accounts in Portugal and abroad, using the new 500 escudo notes to purchase assets, stocks, and other currencies that could be moved quietly across borders. The scale of the fraud was enormous, but the real sophistication lay in how Reis inserted the notes into the banking system without drawing immediate attention. He sent accomplices to different cities, where they opened bank accounts and deposited stacks of the 500 escudo notes, treating them as if they were nothing more than ordinary cash from wealthy clients or colonial investors. Bank tellers examined the notes, checked the watermarks, and recorded them into their ledgers, because the notes were technically authentic. They simply did not know that the bank had not ordered that particular batch. Every time the forged notes passed through a bank, they were accepted as legal tender, and their presence in the system quietly grew. Over time, the Banco de Portugal began to notice anomalies in the currency circulating in the economy. The central bank's records showed that the number of 500 escudo notes in circulation was higher than the total it had ever authorized, and the serial numbers told the same story. Duplicate numbers that should not have existed. When officials cross-checked these numbers and traced deposits, they realized that the Banco de Angola e Metropo and the supposed foreign consortium behind it did not match up with any of the bank's own documentation. The chain of suspicion led back to Alves dos Reis, and by the end of 1925 the story was breaking into the public press. On December 5, 1925, the Lisbon newspaper O Século ran a front-page exposé on what would quickly become known as the Portuguese banknote crisis, or the Angola e Metrópole affair. The article revealed that unknown quantities of 500 escudo notes, all printed with the same official plates, were flooding the economy and that the central bank had not ordered them. The revelation triggered panic among the public and the financial elite because it meant that the very foundation of the currency, the idea that the bank controlled the money supply, had been violated. The Banco de Portugal responded by ordering the immediate withdrawal of all 500 escudo notes, giving the public only a few days to exchange them before the denomination would effectively be taken out of circulation. As the recall proceeded, banks across the country began to receive mountains of 500 escudo notes, some of which were quickly identified as duplicates. By the end of the withdrawal period, the Banco de Portugal had pulled in more than 115,000 of the unauthorized 500 escudo notes, a clear sign that the fraud had spread far beyond anyone's expectations. The crisis did not just damage the reputation of the bank. It hammered the escudo's value on international markets, causing the currency to fall sharply and further eroding trust in the Portuguese government. At the same time, Alves Reis himself was on the move, trying to stay one step ahead of the authorities. He had been en route from the colony of Angola to Lisbon aboard the German ship Adolf Wurmann, carrying the rest of his fortune and the remnants of the scheme with him. By the time the ship reached Portuguese waters, word of the scandal had traveled fast, and officials were preparing to arrest anyone connected to the notes. One of his key accomplices, a German financier named Adolf Hennies, managed to slip away and escape, using his share of the stolen money to disappear under a new identity. Reis, however, refused to flee. Instead, he insisted on returning to Lisbon to face the situation, apparently believing that he could talk his way out of the mess. He was arrested in late 1925, at the age of 28, and charged with fraud, forgery, and undermining the state's financial system. The trial that followed dragged on for several years, partly because Reis claimed that certain high-ranking officials in the Banco de Portugal and even elements of the government had secretly been involved in the scheme. This accusation cast a shadow over the entire elite, and the judiciary moved cautiously, reluctant to uncover corruption that might implicate powerful figures. Eventually, in 1930, the court rejected those claims and convicted Reis, sentencing him to 20 years in prison. Even behind bars, Reis remained a figure of fascination, reportedly converting to Protestantism and trying to convert other prisoners to his beliefs, while still maintaining that he was a victim of the political and financial system he had tried to exploit. He served most of his sentence and was released in 1945, by which time the world had changed dramatically, and the Portugal he had tried to manipulate was under a dictatorship led by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Offered a position in a bank, a bitter irony given his past, Reis reportedly turned it down, and he died in 1955 of a heart attack. leaving behind a reputation as one of the most audacious financial fraudsters in modern history. The economic and political consequences of the 1925 banknote crisis ran far beyond Rice's personal fate. The escudo, already shaky, lost even more credibility, weakening an economy that had barely recovered from the First World War and the disruptions of the 1910s. The scandal fed a growing sense that the First Republic, which had ruled Portugal since 1910, was too unstable and corrupt to manage the country's finances. Many historians argue that the crisis helped create the conditions for the military coup of 1926, which ended the Republic and ushered in years of authoritarian rule, eventually leading to the long-lasting Salazar dictatorship. The story also left a permanent mark on the world of central banking and currency security. The fact that a single man with forged documents could persuade a reputable printing firm to produce such a massive volume of high-denomination banknotes led to tighter controls on who could order new print runs and how those orders were authenticated. Governments and central banks began to rethink how they managed contracts with printers, built in better cross-checks between issuance records and physical notes, and gradually improved the layers of security built into banknotes themselves. To collectors and historians of finance, the 500 escudo notes tied to the Angola e Metropoli affair became legendary. Because they were physically identical to legitimate notes but were never officially authorized, they sit in a strange gray area between real money and part of the most famous banknote fraud of the 20th century. Some of the notes that were withdrawn and destroyed survive in museum collections and private hands, reminders of the day when a small-time forger came closer than anyone else to hijacking an entire national currency from the outside. PMG notes +2. What makes the story of Alves dos Reis especially striking is that he did not try to invent new money out of thin air. Instead, he slipped into the existing machinery of the banking system and pushed its own mechanisms against itself. He did not have an army or a government post, and he did not overthrow a regime by force. He simply forged a document, persuaded a printer, and then watched as the institutions meant to regulate the economy took his forged notes, counted them as real, and let them spread through the country. In that sense, the Portuguese banknote crisis of 1925 is not just a story of a clever fraudster, but a warning about how fragile the line can be between trust and chaos when people believe that the system is working, even as someone else is quietly rewriting the rules behind the scenes. Portugal +3.